Creating consumer profiles, identifying your consumer, part 2. So we've already uncovered some of the indicative content. You should have done your trend forecast now and be receiving some feedback. And we're also working simultaneously on identifying your store's consumer profile, or at least one of their consumers. So we're in week 1, we're working through everything. We've done the trend forecast, and now we're trying to find out who our store's consumers are. Now, typically any store would have maybe 3 to 5, possibly more consumer profiles. But as you've only got 6 weeks for this project, we're just looking for you to identify one of those and then create your range targeted at that consumer to buy into. So for consumer, researching your store's consumer. As aspiring buyers, it is essential you gain an in-depth understanding of your consumers in order to ensure your product appeals and, most importantly, sells to that consumer. By researching like you did last week and understanding who your store's consumer is, you can target your product ranges so that they appeal to them, making your company money and keeping you in work in the future. So let's look at point 2, what you need to do here. Consumer identification. So using primary, which is your primary research, your questionnaires and focus groups you did last week, and secondary research to develop a target consumer profile for your chosen retailer. So for your secondary research, you can also use things from some places like WGSN, Mintel, LSN Global to back up any information on consumers as well. So you should consider the consumer psychographics and buying motives to develop a visual consumer profile with some written annotation introducing your consumer that you've identified, their behaviour, and most importantly, their buying motives, what makes them buy. This should be a key factor for your range planning process. So once you understand who this consumer is, when you develop the range next week, it needs to be targeted at that consumer. So hopefully making them want to buy into it. Finally, you should include a psychographic profile graph, which I've got another lecture on, plotting your consumer on there, showing how quickly they adopt to trends. For your questionnaires and quote focus groups last week, you should now have information to start working out who your consumer is, their behaviour, what's their lifestyle like, and their buying motives. What motivates them to buy? Why do they go and buy clothes from your store? You should have your primary research, and as I mentioned, you should also include secondary research, so research into tribes and reports from secondary sources such as WGSN, Edited, Mintel, Business of Fashion, and LSN Global. All the above become evidence to build your final vision of who your brand and retailer's consumer is. So building a profile. So consumer profiles are a vision of a consumer, not an actual consumer. So we don't just look at one person and build a profile from that. We look at the results and information we've got from all our research and then create an overall vision of a single consumer. So consumer profiles combine a combination of information, demographic information, which typically comes from the facts that you obtain from your questionnaire, such as where they work, how old they are, locations, then psychographic profile, information, their lifestyle and personality, typically information that you get from your focus groups. So that more qualitative information, why they're buying, what other brands they like, why they're shopping at those brands, and so on. This information combined will help you build that typology, giving a full picture of who that consumer is. So defining your consumer. A consumer profile is a way of describing a consumer categorically so that they can be grouped for marketing and advertising purposes. It is important as a buyer and or merchandiser for your chosen brand or retailer that you understand who your consumer or consumers are so that when you're developing your product ranges, they appeal to them and then they essentially purchase those items. So you can't just go and design a collection that you think looks nice. It has to be designed and created knowing that consumer is going to want to buy into it. They'll like those colours, they'll adopt to those trends and so on. As a shorthand way of talking about consumers, market segments are often represented by consumer profiles built up of information from demographic and ethnographic studies, essentially the research you've gathered from your questionnaires and focus groups. So let's begin with market segmentation, which we visited in the first module. Thinking about consumers in terms of the way they are represented by categorical tiers can be useful. The first tier includes the most common categories for describing consumers, such as demographics, where they live, who they are, socioeconomic status. Remember, we've talked about type A, type B, 1, etc., and product usage. The second tier extends to the concept of the first tier, but includes psychographics, their buying motives, for example, generation. Remember, we talked about cohorts, geography, locations, geodemographics, and benefits sought. So let's take a look at those in a bit more detail. So market segmentation is the process of dividing a market of potential consumers into groups or segments based on their different characteristics, the information that you've essentially found from conducting your questionnaire and focus group research last week. The segments created are composed of consumers who will respond similarly to market strategies and who share traits such as similar interests, needs, or even locations. And a quick way of defining them, if you remember, is by referring to their social economic group, their acorn group, and their generation cohort. So you're not needing to write huge essays here. You're summarizing all that information by categorizing your consumer into these areas. So let's remind ourselves. Social economic groups refer to where that consumer or that person is in terms of their kind of career. And we basically have type A, B, C1, C2, D, and E. Type A refers to that high managerial, administrative, or someone who's in a professional career, down to E for all of those entirely dependent on the state long term, and then everything in between. So it might be that you've got a range of different careers and things. You don't need to list all of those. You can literally select the category, the social economic group that most refers to them. It may well be that your consumer identifies with two of these groups. So it might be that they're intermediate or managerial or supervisory or clerical administration. So they could be type B as well as C1. Then we've got these acorn categories. Now I've given them summary here, but the best thing to do is click on my hyperlink here and look at them. It gives a much more in-depth insight into actually who that consumer is. And again, you may well find that they identify with more than one group here, which is absolutely fine. You could list maybe even up to 3 or 5. That's absolutely fine. Then the generational cohorts is what we've talked about before, and these are easily sort of defined, but they're generations of people that generally share similar kind of traits and beliefs. So, for example, you've got the traditionalists, that the older generation that we've got at the moment, the baby boomers, the Generation X, the millennials, and probably your own generation, which is Generation Z. So again, you can translate them into these cohorts, which groups people together. Now, we've also talked briefly about Maslow's theory of hierarchy. Now, Maslow was a psychologist from years ago who defined basically just the basic human needs for things. So our basic needs for things, if we just sort of are around today, is the first thing you'd need if you just arrived on a desert island would be food, warmth, water, and rest. You then search for safety before trying to group up with people and create a kind of community. Once you've established a community and becoming that, you basically want to be accepted by that community. And once you've got that, you aspire for self-actualization. You can go beyond that, needing things beyond what are their everyday needs, those psychological needs at the bottom. And this refers to even when we're looking at things like marketing. We've got the rational buyer who will literally just go out and buy a coat because maybe their old one's perished, it doesn't fit anymore, or it isn't keeping them warm, so they need to buy a new coat. You then got the emotional buyer who might see a coat that they love scrolling through Instagram. They don't need it, but they just love it. It's new season, they love the colour, perhaps it's a new shape. Then you've got the patronage buyer who is at the very, very top, who's willing to spend a lot more, perhaps buy something that's designer or luxury kind of nature, who again doesn't need that coat, but is willing to spend a lot more money than they actually kind of need to basically self-fulfill their requirements. So we refer back to this Maslow's theory of hierarchy, looking at a fashion triangle even in the future too. So that basically outlines that. So you can even look at your consumer and decide whether they're that rational, emotional, or patronage buyer. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Like I said, a rational buyer is looking for something for basic human needs. That coat, again, they need to purchase. It's a logical purchase, often utilitarian, and they're buying for that purpose, i.e. they need a new coat, their old one isn't fit for purpose. Then you've got the emotional buyer. They're simply falling in love with something stylish. They don't need it, they just want it. And that can often be for social acceptance because they belong to a group. They want to be seen to adopting the new fashion or new style or fitting in with their group. Curiosity or just simply change, looking for self-improvement or boost their self-esteem or confidence at the same time. Then finally, you've got that patronage buyer who explains the consumer who chooses one store over another. They become loyal to that in a longer term. Quite often somebody who shops at somewhere like John Lewis becomes a real patronage buyer. They'll keep going back. They know there's always good service. They know they can always return easily. They can trust the quality of the buys that are there. So a patronage buyer could include brand allegiance, the convenience of shopping at a store like John Lewis where there's that trust, They've got good assortment. It can be the services offered, like just good customer service. And they, like, for example, knowing you can return easily, and knowing there's good sales service within there too. So those are the three types of behavior that people buy into. So try and define which one of those your consumer buys into. So I'm asking you to do a task of this. There's a printout provided, it's as a PDF on your VLE. Start to note down all the different things that you find from your consumer identification. So start to think about who they are, the general age group. And again, you don't need to list all the ages, just the age groups that yours fit into. If you've suddenly got somebody who, most people are between 25 and 35, then you've got two who are 65. Leave those ones out because they'll skew your results. Circle which cohort they fit into. Where do they live? Again, from where they live, can you define them by an ACORN group? What is their occupations there? And then can you fit them into a social economic group? How much do they spend if you've asked that? And what are they most likely to purchase? Then you can start to think about their behavior, their preferred brands. What social media do they use in engagement with? What do they do in their spare time? Preferred bands? What music do they listen about? What are they passionate about? And how and when, most importantly, will they interact with your brand? Try and note those down. And then finally, buying motives. What makes your consumers shop at your retailer over others? And how important is price over quality for them? Is your consumer a rational, emotional, or patronage buyer? So in your own time, try and work this out. And try and quote, most importantly, actual information from your focus group and questionnaires here. Once you've done that, you should have a good idea of who your consumer is. If you don't, consider doing another questionnaire or perhaps conducting another small focus group. This quite often happens in real life too. You can get skewed information. So if you need to go back and do more research, please do that and continue in your own time. Once you're ready, start to create one visual consumer profile, giving an overview, a vision of who that consumer is. You should present your profiles visually with text mainly and some annotation, including the following: identifying their social economic status, their ACORN group, their generational cohort, and give their idea of what their buying motives are. Are they emotional, rational, or patronage buyer? And why have you defined them as that? And of course, include any other information you've gathered from your questionnaire or focus group that describes who your store consumer is. So let's look at some examples from the past. So this was Elaine, it's from a couple of years ago. She's got a few images here, a bit of an overview of who that is, and then again has listed all those categories there. Katie's, again, has done it really nicely. She's given the consumer a name, a bit of a blurb about them, and then listed those market segmentation categories along the left-hand side there, along with a little bit of information about the technology, key traits and hobbies that they're into as well. She's also then gone on to describe their buying behaviour and motives in a few sentences too, which is also really nice. And she's got some key quotes from her own primary research there, which is really, really important to include. Then we've got Grace's, who's followed the same kind of thing. So again, images and the information there and market segmentation categories with a bit of an overview of who that consumer is. And then she's gone on to describe their buying behaviour and buying motives in a few bullet points as well, along with some images, which I think looks really nice as well. So remember, you're completing your consumer identification here using your primary and secondary research to develop one consumer profile for your chosen retailer. You're including, you should consider consumer psychographics and buying motives to develop a visual consumer profile with some written annotation, including the consumer, their behaviour and their buying motives. Finally, you should include a psychographic profile graph plotting your consumer with some annotation explaining why you've positioned them in that area. And remember, there is a lecture on this as well. So completing point 2, what should you include? Consider providing an overview of your questionnaire results and perhaps your focus group narrative too, that visual consumer profile that we've talked about, and then finally plotting that consumer on a psychographic profile with some annotation. If we look at Deeja's here from last year, she's got a title page for this section, an overview of her questionnaire results, some script from her focus group, her consumer profile, and where she's plotted it on the psychographic profile graph with a bit of annotation there, giving insight into why she's placed her consumer profiles on that area. Now, note last year they created 2 consumer profiles. This year you're just doing 1. Further information on my bibliography is here. Thank you.